Let's rank every Overlord in Hazbin Hotel from weakest to strongest. So obviously a few things to get out of the way. For one, there are a bunch of Overlords that I will be mentioning at the start that have no real scaling, so I can't really talk about them that much. Now by the time Season 2 comes out, there might be a bunch of stuff that says they're strong, but as of this point, I will be putting them at the bottom since they have no feats and no real statements. So without further ado, let's rank every Overlord from weakest to strongest in Hazbin Hotel. So first things first, the two Overlords that are probably the weakest that we have no statements and no feats for are Zestial and Velvet. The only real thing we can say for these two characters is the fact that they're Overlords in the first place, which seems to require thousands if not hundreds of thousands of souls. We can't even say these characters have some type of weapon to give them long range battle or some type of ability to give them an advantage. Due to this, I don't think we can say anything. So yeah, realistically the only reason these characters are at the bottom is because they literally have nothing to show to give them anything higher. Even the characters above them who have only slightly more are still higher because they have at least something. Which also works as a good segue into my next two characters being Husk and Valentino. I think these two are interchangeable. Realistically, the only reason these two characters are above Zestial and Velvet is due to the fact that they have offensive attacking. For example, we know Husk has his cards which he can use offensively at long range, mid range and short range, and on top of that we know Valentino has his wings which he uses to blow fire away, and then his guns. These two things are just literally just enough to put them above the other two. But at the same time too though, that's the reason why these two aren't above one another. They also have pretty much literally nothing apart from the fact that they have long range, mid range attacks, and on top of that the wings don't give me enough evidence to put Valentino above Husk. Especially since we're talking about Overlords here. Overlords are not going to die to a little bit of fire, so you being able to blow away a little bit of fire does not tell me you can defeat another Overlord. Now with all the weak ones out of the way, let's talk about the top 5, the ones that are actually strong within Hazbin Hotel. Now for me personally, number 5 seems to be the easiest to rank, that being Rosie. Rosie is stated by Alastor to be the strongest Overlord her side of the pentagram, which means from the very get-go we know Rosie is stronger than multiple other Overlords. But the only real question is, why doesn't this put her higher? Well, it's actually quite obvious. A pentagram has 5 to 10 different sides to it. If you count the points, it's 10. Which means while this does imply she's the strongest within this point of the pentagram, it doesn't apply to the rest of them, so therefore it can't put her automatically higher. But wait a minute, if that's really obvious, what about the next 4? Who's the 4th strongest and who's the more controversial one? Well, to me, the 4th strongest Overlord within Hazbin Hotel has to be Vox. Now, before you get your pitchforks and start raging in the comments, let me explain. First things first, it seems to be heavily narratively implied that Vox is the strongest of the Vees. And if you take that into account, that's already equivalent enough to match Rosie, but there's more. If you really think about it, Vox has a bunch of insane feats. One of the biggest ones being the fact that when he short circuits, he instantly short circuits the rest of the Pride Ring, which is an insane feat if you think about it. If you think about it, the Pride Ring is stated along with the other rings to have multiple cities within it. So yeah, Vox is short circuiting multiple cities at once. Not to mention, in terms of speed feats, he's probably one of the fastest based on the fact that he travels via electricity. But wait a minute, am I forgetting something? I hear everyone saying in the comments things like, well, Vox is stated to have beaten Alastor. That's not true. That's never said. Now let's take a second to actually look at this. What did Valentino actually say to Vox? Valentino says, and I quote, "Are you still mad that he almost beat you?" Now if you look at the statement alone and not take any of the context, sure, it might seem that way, but let's actually think about it for a second. For one, Valentino says that Alastor owes all of them something, not just Vox. What does this mean? On top of this, if you look at the song itself, Alastor says that Vox is not as strong as he seems and that he's powerless without the other Vees. If you take a second to actually think about it, that type of statement doesn't make sense about a character who defeated you. Another thing that doesn't make much sense is, why is Vox so mad if he had won the fight? For example, you think about it, if I defeated someone in a close fight, even if I hated them, why would I have this type of anger towards them about said interaction if I won? Especially if you take into account how confident Alastor is towards Vox. He refers to him as power so nonchalant as if it doesn't mean anything. Now the current theory that I'm running with is the idea that Vox almost lost to Alastor and then the other Vees jumped in and that's how they jumped on Alastor. This works pretty well with the dynamic of the Vees themselves, which is the fact that they're Overlords that work together to overcome the single point. So yeah, there are more things I could bring up, but I'm going to save them for Alastor's part of the video, so let's move on to the next person. Now for me, the 3rd strongest character within the Hazbin Hotel franchise is none other than Zestial. Now there's a few reasons why I have Zestial so high, one of the biggest ones being the fact that he's the oldest living Overlord. The reason I take this with such respect is because it has to mean something. If you're the longest living Overlord and survived the whole era including Alastor's slaughter, you have to be pretty strong. Especially when you take into account how frightened people are of Zestial, and on top of that the amount of respect Alastor has for Zestial. And for me personally, that's the type of stuff I would take over being the strongest Overlord within one side of the pentagram, because that's something that would apply to Rosie and Vox. So yeah, as much as this isn't the most concrete conclusion, that's my personal conclusion for why I have Zestial higher than the rest of the characters on the list apart from the next two. Now one last thing before we get into the final 2 characters of the list, I recently launched a Patreon. Now basically, to describe it, my Patreon is a paid service that you can subscribe to get even more content and interaction with me directly. This way I can finally work towards being able to to put more time towards his YouTube channel, and on top of that, I can give you even more exclusive content like weekly extra uploads. So yeah guys, link in the description, please check it out, it would really help. And this brings us to number 2, and if it wasn't obvious already, number 2 on the list is Carmilla Carmine. Now there's 2 things on this list that determine her placement. Number 2 being her age. Yes, she is a very old Overlord, a lot like Zestial, maybe not as old as Zestial, but still old nonetheless. And on top of this amazing fact, she also possesses angelic weaponry, which Zestial has no known counter for. On top of that, she's an amazing fighter. And you gotta remember, Carmilla isn't your basic exorcist, she's way stronger than that, just judging by her interactions with Vaggie. And we did just see her fight off the exorcist, she's no slouch, so realistically, I don't see a good way Zestial could defeat Carmilla. But wait a minute, there's only one Overlord left that's strong enough to be number 1, and that one obviously has to be Alastor. Now first things first, there's a few arguments we can bring up, the biggest one being the fact that Alastor is stated in the pilot to have the most power out of any sinner has ever harnessed. And on top of this fact, if it wasn't obvious already, every Overlord in Hazbin Hotel is a sinner, they're all from the Pride Ring, and they are all past sinners. Now, even if you want to try and argue this statement should only apply to Overlords that pre-existed Alastor, it would still apply to characters like Zestial and Carmilla, therefore he's still number 1. Also, just to double back to the Vox stuff, yes, as I said previously with Vox, all the statements applying to Alastor are way too inconsistent to apply, and could mean 100 different things. And that's not even everything. If you didn't know, soul dealing is how we see sinners become Overlords in the first place, yet Alastor is the only Overlord who's done soul dealing with another Overlord. So Alastor owns the soul of Husk, who owns souls of thousands just like every other Overlord does. Now one last thing, one more detail that's really important, Alastor does have a counter to angelic weaponry, unlike the rest of the list. For those who don't remember, in the season 1 finale, we see Alastor's force field be able to block off exorcists. They weren't able to bypass it even with their weaponry, and were actually getting taken down by the force field itself. And since the only thing that we saw that was strong enough to bypass the force field was Adam's punch, I don't see anything that would tell me that Carmilla can do it herself. Therefore, if we're being realistic for a second, I don't see how Alastor would lose to Carmilla. But that's realistically all I have time for today. I hope you did enjoy this video. Let me know in the comments your positioning on who wins these fights, and let me know who you think the strongest Overlord is. Have a great day everyone, and please check out the Patreon below.